The lecture hall fell silent as Marcus took his seat, his worn-out notebook in hand. The stares told him everything. He didn't belong. Then came the equation, complex and unforgiving. A smirk from the professor, a whisper from a student. Let's see if he can keep up. Marcus took a deep breath. They had no idea what was coming. What happened next would leave the entire room in the stunned silence and expose a harsh truth about who gets to be called a genius. Marcus Carter had always been different, not because he wasn't brilliant, but because people refused to see it. Growing up in a small southern town, he had spent nights under a dim desk lamp, solving equations far beyond his grade level. Numbers made sense to him in a way the world never did. So when he earned a scholarship to one of the country's most prestigious universities, he thought things would finally change. He thought he'd be judged by his mind, not his skin. But from the moment he stepped onto campus, the whispers followed. Professors barely acknowledged him. Classmates looked past him. He wasn't just a student. He was a test, an anomaly, a question they didn't want answered. And soon they would try to prove he didn't belong. Marcus sat near the back of the lecture hall, his notebook open, his pen poised. The professor, Dr. Whitmore, paced in front of the chalkboard, his tailored suit crisp, his expression unreadable. Today we'll tackle a problem most of you won't solve without help, he announced, turning to the board. With swift, confident strokes, he filled the space with a complex equation, numbers and symbols twisting together like a puzzle only a genius could crack. Marcus leaned forward, already seeing the solution form in his mind. But before he could speak, a voice cut through the silence. Maybe we should give Carter a shot, one of the students sneered. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Dr. Whitmore smirked, tapping the chalk against his palm. Interesting idea. Mr. Carter, care to take the board? Marcus hesitated, not because he was unsure, but because he recognized the game. This wasn't about learning, it was a test, a setup. The unspoken challenge in their eyes was clear. Prove you belong. Slowly he rose. The weight of dozens of stairs pressed against his back as he made his way to the front. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but his hands remained steady as he picked up the chalk. He scanned the equation once more. Then with precise, practiced movements, he began solving it, each stroke of chalk cutting through their doubts. At first the room was silent, then whispers. No way. Is that right? He's just guessing. Dr. Whitmore's smirk faded. He leaned in, eyes narrowing. Careful now, Carter. Wouldn't want to embarrass yourself. Marcus didn't flinch. His fingers tightened around the chalk, and with one final stroke, he completed the equation. Perfectly. The silence that followed was different this time. Heavy, uncomfortable. Then came the laughter. Low at first, then growing. One student scoffed, another shook his head. Lucky guess, someone muttered. Dr. Whitmore exhaled sharply, stepping forward. Not bad, he said. But real intelligence isn't about shortcuts. Let's try something more challenging. He erased the board in swift, aggressive motions, then replaced it with an even more advanced equation, one that sprawled across the surface like an unsolvable riddle. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. They weren't going to let him win. He turned, scanning the faces in the room. Smirks, doubt, that same quiet expectation. He'd fail eventually. Marcus took a deep breath. If they wanted a show, he was about to give them one. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward, his fingers wrapping around the chalk once more. The equation before him was brutal, layers upon layers of symbols and variables, meant to crush confidence, not inspire it. The weight of expectation, their expectation of his failure, pressed against him. A single mistake would confirm what they already believed, that he didn't belong, that his earlier success was luck, not intelligence. He started writing. The room, once filled with quiet mockery, was now deathly silent. Each number, each formula, flowed from his mind onto the board like second nature. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't hesitating. He was proving them all wrong. Dr. Whitmore's arms tightened across his chest. The smirk was gone. The students shifted in their seats. A few leaned forward, watching as Marcus worked through the impossible equation with unshakable confidence. Then, the final stroke. Marcus underlined his answer and set the chalk down. He turned, face calm, but his heart thundered. Dr. Whitmore stared at the board, jaw tightening. He was checking for a flaw, searching for any excuse to dismiss Marcus's work. The professor's silence stretched long enough that murmurs spread across the room. Then one voice rang out. "Wait! He got it right!" A hush fell over the lecture hall. Some students exchanged glances. Some looked down, avoiding Marcus's gaze. But Dr. Whitmore, his lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes flickered with something darker than disappointment, resentment. Finally, he spoke. "You must have seen this problem before." Marcus's stomach twisted. Even now, even after proving himself in front of the entire class, it wasn't enough. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Dr. Whitmore grabbed the eraser and wiped away his work as if it had never existed. Marcus stood frozen, his breath unsteady. He had given them proof. He had shattered their expectations. And still, they refused to see him. The sting of it burned deep. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Marcus stood frozen as his work disappeared under the sweep of Dr. Whitmore's eraser. The answer was gone, but the truth remained. They saw it. They all saw it. He turned to the class. Some avoided his gaze, unwilling to acknowledge what had just happened. But others? A few students stared at the empty board, their expressions shifting from amusement to discomfort. They knew. They couldn't unsee it. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't beg for validation. He simply picked up his notebook, tucked it under his arm, and walked back to his seat. Because he understood something now. His intelligence wasn't the problem. Their bias was. That day, Marcus learned that proving himself wasn't enough. That no matter how brilliant he was, some people would rather erase his success than admit they had misjudged him. But that didn't mean he would stop. It meant he had to push harder, be louder, take up space they refused to give him. Because this wasn't just about one student in one classroom. It was about every black mind underestimated, every voice silenced, every achievement questioned. Marcus went on to graduate at the top of his class. Years later, when his name was etched into academic history, Dr. Whitmore's faded into obscurity. But the question remains, how many more brilliant minds will be doubted, dismissed, erased before we stop pretending this isn't happening?